It's October 13th, 1942. 0347 hours. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. A wrench slips. Sergeant Joe Foss snags it from the air, a breath away from the mud. His hands are a mess, caked in black oil, and slick with blood from a gash on his knuckle he can't even remember getting. All around him, the wreckage of war glows under makeshift floodlights, nothing more than cargo parachutes stretched over bamboo poles, powered by a generator that sputters and coughs like a dying man. The air is thick with the smell of high-octane fuel, scorched metal, and that ever-present jungle rot that seeps into everything on this island. Before him sit 3 Grumman F4F Wildcats, but they're more like puzzles. This one is missing its engine entirely. Another has an engine with a cracked cylinder head. The third has bullet holes punched clean through its oil cooler, and a propeller bent into the shape of a question mark. Behind him, a Marine lieutenant checks his watch. "Sunrise is in 2 hours, Sergeant. The Tokyo Express will be right behind it." Foss doesn't look up. His hands just keep moving, tracing the engine block, feeling for a hairline fracture he just knows is there. Out in the darkness, another mechanic is salvaging pistons from a Wildcat that was torched 3 days ago. Another guy is hand-filing a replacement valve from a chunk of a Japanese truck axle. By dawn, these planes will fly. They have to, because 12 Japanese Zeros are on their way. And right now, the entire Cactus Air Force has exactly 4 aircraft that can get in the air to meet them. The wrench turns. Metal grinds against metal. The work goes on. To really grasp what brought these men to this desperate moment, we need to step back 6 months, to a war that was being lost in slow motion across the entire Pacific. In the spring of 1942, the Empire of Japan controlled a territory larger than the continental United States. From the frozen rocks of the Aleutians to the jungles of New Guinea, from the beaches of Burma to the coral atolls of the Marshall Islands, the rising sun flag flew over conquered land at a pace that left military planners in Washington utterly stunned. The Japanese combined fleet ruled the ocean. Their pilots, veterans of China and Pearl Harbor, dominated the skies with a kill ratio that made American commanders physically sick when they read the reports. The Battle of Midway in June changed the strategic calculus, but not the daily reality. America had stopped Japan's advance, sunk 4 carriers, and bought time. But time for what? The United States was fighting a global war on multiple fronts, with an industrial base still frantically converting from peacetime production. Picture this. Every single aircraft, every engine, every last spare part had to survive a perilous journey across thousands of miles of submarine-infested waters just to get into the fight. The Japanese, by contrast, were operating from established bases, with mature supply lines and repair facilities they had built up over years of conquest. Guadalcanal would be America's first major offensive in the Pacific, and it was launched with a kind of dangerous optimism. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division stormed the beaches and captured a half-built Japanese airfield on the island's northern lowlands. The strategic logic was crystal clear. Whoever controlled that airfield controlled the air. Whoever controlled the air controlled the sea approaches. And whoever controlled the sea approaches controlled the entire southern Solomon Islands chain and with it the vital sea lanes to Australia. The Marines renamed it Henderson Field, after a pilot killed at Midway, and just days later the first American aircraft were landing on its single runway of coral and dirt. But the Japanese had absolutely no intention of giving up the island.
What followed was a grinding, desperate struggle that military historians would later call one of the most brutal campaigns in modern warfare. Almost every night, Japanese warships sailed down from Rabaul in what became known as the Tokyo Express. They'd shell Henderson Field with battleship guns, land fresh troops, and be gone before dawn.
Japanese bombers attacked nearly every day. Japanese infantry launched fanatical nighttime assaults against the marine perimeter. For the men trying to keep the planes flying from Henderson Field, the situation was borderline impossible. There was no prepared infrastructure, no maintenance hangars, no machine shops, and no parts depot. Everything had to be improvised, using whatever materials they could find on the island or salvage from wrecked aircraft. The mechanics worked in open-air revetments, exposed to tropical downpours that turned the airfield into a sea of mud, and to Japanese bombs that cratered the runway and sent shrapnel tearing through parked planes. Supply convoys arrived sporadically, and they were always under strength. Terrified of Japanese air attacks, cargo ships would race in at dawn, unload in a frenzy, and flee before noon. Many never made it at all, torpedoed by submarines or sunk by bombers. And the supplies that did get through? They were often the wrong items entirely. They were getting crates of bayonets when they desperately needed engine oil, pallets of rations when cylinders and pistons were the only thing standing between survival and total annihilation. Requisition forms were meaningless. The idea of proper channels was a complete fiction. The paper reality of military logistics simply dissolved into the mud and chaos of Guadalcanal. Suddenly, aircraft availability became the single most critical factor in the entire campaign. On paper, the Cactus Air Force, as it was informally known, was assigned dozens of fighters and bombers. But in reality, on any given morning, the number of planes that could actually fly could be counted on two hands. Aircraft that landed damaged in the morning had to be back in the air by the afternoon. Pilots were flying 3, sometimes 4 missions a day, in planes that should have been grounded for a major overhaul. The mechanics were performing miracles, cramming 100-hour maintenance checks into 100-minute windows between enemy raids. The Japanese, on the other hand, understood numbers. Their intelligence officers tracked American aircraft through radio intercepts, Coast Watcher reports, and pilot debriefs. They knew how many planes had landed on Guadalcanal. They knew how many they had shot down or destroyed on the ground. From their perspective, the math was simple and looking increasingly good for them. Attrition was grinding the Americans down to nothing. What the Japanese couldn't possibly calculate was the secret weapon that existed in the mud between the wrecked aircraft and the makeshift workshops. These American mechanics weren't products of formal military aviation schools. 9 months earlier, most of them had been civilians. They were farm boys from Iowa who had rebuilt tractor engines in dirt floor barns. They were factory workers from Detroit who knew how to make a production line move. They were garage owners from small towns across the Midwest who had spent their lives making broken things work with whatever was on hand. The military had taught them the specifications, the manuals, and all the proper procedures. Guadalcanal taught them to forget every last one of them. The Pratt & Whitney R1830 radial engine in the F4F Wildcat was a magnificent piece of engineering. 14 cylinders in 2 rows, producing 1,200 horsepower, designed to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The technical manual for a proper overhaul was 3 inches thick. It called for clean rooms, precision tools, factory-certified parts, and trained specialists. Henderson Field had none of these things. What it did have were men willing to ignore what couldn't be done and focus entirely on what had to be done. Sergeant Robert Gaylor, a mechanic from the VMF 224 Squadron, later described their process in a way that would have given the Pratt & Whitney engineers a heart attack. They were pulling engines from crashed aircraft while the metal was still warm. Cylinder heads cracked by bullet strikes were welded back together using rods they scavenged from wrecked Japanese vehicles. Pistons that didn't match? They were hand-filed down until they fit. Magnetos were cleaned with raw gasoline and dried with compressed air from literal hand pumps. Oil filters were improvised out of parachute silk. Gaskets were cut from leather boots. When precision measuring tools were simply unavailable, the mechanics used their hands, their ears, and the gut instincts they developed over years of just making things run. Now contrast this with their enemy. The Japanese flew the formidable Mitsubishi A6M0, an aircraft designed and maintained under a rigid industrial doctrine. Every single part was manufactured to exact specifications. Every maintenance procedure followed a strict, established protocol. Japanese mechanics were incredibly skilled, but they worked within a system that demanded conformity and precision. If a specific part was unavailable, that aircraft was grounded, period, until proper supply channels delivered the correct replacement. This meticulous approach worked superbly when supply lines were intact and bases were secure. But it became a fatal weakness the moment those conditions disappeared. At Henderson Field, by late September, the very concept of proper parts had ceased to exist. The men started treating the growing pile of wrecked aircraft as their own personal parts depot. A Wildcat destroyed on the ground by Japanese shelling might have an intact engine that could be transplanted into another airframe. A plane shot down offshore and recovered by a Higgins boat could yield instruments, wiring, and hydraulic lines. Even aircraft damaged beyond any hope of flight were priceless. A single crashed fighter represented a treasure trove of hundreds of salvageable components. And this work happened in conditions that defy description. The tropical heat turned metal too hot to touch with bare hands. Afternoon rains flooded the work areas, turning every tool into a mud-caked weight. Mosquitoes carrying malaria swarmed in clouds. Dysentery was universal. Men worked with raging fevers, with infected wounds, with an exhaustion so profound they would fall asleep standing up with wrenches still clutched in their hands. All while Japanese bombs fell during the day and Japanese warships shelled the field all through the night. There was never a safe moment, never a chance for genuine rest. And yet, the aircraft just kept flying. Day after day, the status reports painted a picture that Japanese intelligence officers simply could not comprehend. American planes they had confirmed as destroyed were suddenly showing up in combat again. Aircraft they'd written off as permanently disabled were now intercepting their raids. The numbers just refused to add up. By early October, Japanese planners were forced to revise their estimates upward. They assumed there had to be hidden reinforcements, or maybe they just underestimated the initial deployments. The possibility that the Americans were literally rebuilding aircraft from piles of wreckage simply did not fit within their operational understanding of how modern warfare was supposed to work. To its credit, the American command structure recognized what was happening and protected it. Officers who, by the book, should have demanded strict adherence to regulations instead just looked the other way. Inspection standards that would have grounded 3/4 of the entire air wing were quietly ignored. An implicit, universal understanding took hold.
The rulebook was written for peacetime, for rear areas, for conditions that no longer existed. Henderson Field operated under a single unwritten law now. If it flies and it fights, it's good enough. Everything else was just theory, and theory had zero survival value in the mud and chaos of Guadalcanal. The mechanics had become the most essential personnel in the entire campaign, even though none of them wore pilot's wings or ever fired a shot in anger. They were winning the air war right there on the ground, one impossible repair at a time, and the Japanese had no idea it was even happening. These mechanics themselves came from everywhere and nowhere. Staff Sergeant James Sweat had operated a small engine repair shop in Sacramento before the war. His specialty had been making elderly farm equipment run for just one more season because Depression-era farmers couldn't afford replacements. He approached aircraft engines the exact same way he had a 1920s thresher held together with baling wire and a prayer. The question was never whether a repair was proper. The only question was whether it would function for the next mission. Sweat developed a reputation for listening to engines. Pilots would taxi in, and he would just cock his head, hearing irregularities in the rhythm that instruments couldn't detect. He could diagnose a failing cylinder by sound alone, and identify a fouled spark plug by the smell of the exhaust. This was not engineering. This wasn't book smarts. This was something older, a gut-level mechanical intuition forged over years of wrestling with machinery that refused to quit, because the men depending on it simply couldn't afford for it to. Take Corporal Thomas Mann. Before enlisting, he was on the Chevrolet assembly line in Detroit. His gift? Pure, unadulterated speed. He could tear down and rebuild components faster than men who'd been doing it for years. On an assembly line, speed meant efficiency. Out here at Henderson Field, speed meant survival. Mann organized his crews with that same production line logic. Each man had a specific task, no wasted motion, no one waiting for the previous step to finish. He'd have 3 different engines in simultaneous states of disassembly, moving between them in a fluid rotation, his hands constantly working. To other mechanics, it looked like pure chaos. Mann knew it was choreographic. He could swap out an entire engine in just 4 hours, when the manual insisted it took 8. He did it by treating these war-torn aircraft like products on a line, and refusing to accept that combat damage was supposed to slow things down. Then you had Private First Class Eddie Bauer. He'd grown up in rural Montana, where the nearest mechanic was 40 miles of bad road away. On the ranch, things broke, and you either fixed them yourself or you went without. He'd rebuilt truck engines with parts from catalogs, often finding the parts were wrong and just forcing them to fit. So naturally, Bauer's specialty became fabrication. When a replacement part didn't exist, he just made one. He carved new engine mounts from aluminum salvaged from crashed Japanese aircraft. He hand-formed exhaust manifolds by heating metal over a fire and hammering it into shape on makeshift anvils. He cut threads into raw metal using dies he improvised from damaged bolts. Other mechanics would declare a component impossible to replace. Bauer would just nod, disappear for 6 hours, and return with something that functioned. It rarely looked like the original. It always worked. The technical challenges they faced would have been impossible under normal circumstances. An aircraft engine is not a forgiving machine. Tolerances are tight. Balance is critical. A piston installed incorrectly can destroy an engine in seconds. An improperly torqued cylinder head can fail catastrophically at altitude. These men were performing precision engineering in the mud, with improvised tools, under the constant threat of imminent death. They had no way to dynamically balance crankshafts. They had no way to X-ray cylinder walls for hairline cracks. They couldn't just plug in an oscilloscope to check magneto-timing or run a pressure test on the fuel systems. They had to rely on something far more fundamental: their eyes, their hands, and their hard-won judgment. The whole process of rebuilding an engine began with a careful assessment. A damaged engine would be pulled, laid out on makeshift benches, often just ammo crates nailed together. Every single component was inspected by eye. If a part was cracked, it was tossed aside. Anything salvageable was meticulously cleaned. The goal? To create one working engine from the remains of two, maybe even three wrecked ones. They were mixing and matching cylinders from different power plants. Pistons were swapped out. Connecting rods were used until they showed the slightest hint of fatigue. Then they'd be replaced with rods scavenged from another engine. The result was a true Frankenstein's monster of an engine, bearing serial numbers from half a dozen different power plants. This practice shattered every single principle of engine management and maintenance tracking. But the incredible thing was, it flew. Cylinder heads, though, were a special kind of nightmare. Battle damage would often crack the delicate aluminum castings right around the valve seats. A proper repair needed factory-grade equipment and highly skilled welders. Henderson Field had neither of those things, so the mechanics developed their own technique. They used acetylene torches scavenged from construction gear and welding rods that were, technically speaking, completely incompatible with aircraft-grade aluminum. They'd preheat the entire cylinder head to reduce thermal stress, carefully weld the crack, and then let it cool down ever so slowly, buried in a pit of sand. Their success rate was maybe 60%. 40% of the time, the weld would fail during testing, and they'd have to start all over again. But think about what that 60% meant. It meant engines that should have been scrap were returning to service. It meant more aircraft in the air. The Japanese fully expected those planes to be gone for good, but the mechanics on the ground simply refused to let that happen. And from the Japanese perspective, what was happening made absolutely no tactical sense. You see, Commander Tadashi Nakajima, an intelligence officer with the 11th Air Fleet, was keeping meticulous records. He tracked American aircraft losses using pilot reports and recon photos, and his logs showed a clear pattern. The Americans had landed about 40 fighters on Guadalcanal by early September. By late September, Japanese attacks had destroyed or damaged at least 30 of them. Sure, a few reinforcements were trickling in, but only slowly and in small numbers. The math was simple. American air strength should have been plummeting to completely unsustainable levels. Yet, somehow, the number of aircraft rising to meet each new Japanese raid seemed to hold steady, or even, impossibly, to increase. In his diary, Nakajima wrestled with a puzzle. Either American reinforcements were vastly larger than his intelligence suggested, or there was something fundamentally wrong with his data. He never even considered the third and most dangerous option, that the Americans were simply refusing to play by his mathematical rules. You see, the Japanese military culture, for all its talk of fighting spirit and relentless aggression, was incredibly rigid. It clung to technical standards and procedural correctness. If a Japanese aircraft was declared damaged beyond field repair, it was written off. Period. A new one would be requested through the proper supply channels. Now, Japanese mechanics were incredibly skilled and dedicated, but they operated strictly within these doctrinal boundaries. Improvisation wasn't just discouraged, it was unthinkable. Deviating from technical specifications, that was seen as introducing an unacceptable risk. And this rigid, by-the-book approach had served Japan well during its early conquests, when supply lines were short and their bases were secure. But here at Guadalcanal, where none of those conditions applied anymore, that strength became a crippling strategic vulnerability, one the Japanese high command never even recognized. Because the innovation exploding at Henderson Field went way beyond just clever mechanical repairs. It represented a fundamental philosophical difference in how Americans approached a problem.
The men working in the mud there had been raised in a culture that celebrated the tinkerer, the backyard inventor, the person who could make do with whatever they had on hand. American folklore is jam-packed with stories of barn-built airplanes and garage-invented machines. And the Great Depression had just taught an entire generation to repair rather than replace, to improvise rather than just wait for a solution to arrive. These weren't just abstract cultural values, they were hard-won survival skills now being unleashed on the battlefield of industrial warfare. A perfect example of this, born from pure desperation, was the partial engine run. Proper engine testing required running an engine at full power for extended periods to verify its performance. At Henderson Field, that was a luxury they almost never had. So, the mechanics developed this incredible ability to test an engine with just a 2-minute ground run, listening for the most subtle variations in sound, watching for the slightest wisp of smoke or hint of vibration, and literally feeling for irregular harmonics through the airframe itself. An experienced mechanic could pinpoint a problem in seconds, a process that should have taken hours of diagnostic testing. They were compressing the entire engineering process down, relying on sheer intuition and accumulated experience. No, it wasn't scientific, but it was remarkably, life-savingly effective.
And huge credit has to go to the leadership at Henderson Field for creating an environment where this kind of bottom-up, get-it-done innovation could not only exist, but absolutely flourish.
Lieutenant Colonel Harold Bauer, the man in charge of VMF 212, was a Naval Academy graduate who got it. He understood military protocol, but he also understood practical necessity. So he made a conscious choice to shield his mechanics from the meddling of higher headquarters. Whenever visiting staff officers started asking questions about non-standard repairs or unauthorized modifications, Bauer would step in. He'd politely inform them that his mechanics were operating under combat conditions and that he would take full responsibility for any deviations from standard procedure. He never once grounded an aircraft because it failed to meet some peacetime technical standard. His pilots trusted the machines implicitly because Bauer trusted the men who pieced them back together. This trust flowed right into the cockpit. Pilots were fully aware they were flying aircraft built from parts that had no business being in the same engine. They knew their planes had been hit, crashed, burned, and resurrected from the graveyard. They flew them anyway because the alternative was not flying at all. Lieutenant Colonel Joe Foss, who would become one of America's greatest aces, later said he never once questioned whether his aircraft would perform. The mechanics had earned their absolute faith. If they said the plane was ready, it was ready. This incredible bond between pilot and mechanic became an intangible advantage, one that never appeared in any Japanese intelligence estimate. The sheer scale of this improvisation just grew as the campaign raged on. By mid-October, mechanics weren't just rebuilding engines, they were modifying them. They increased the boost pressure on some engines to squeeze out more power, accepting a shorter engine life in exchange for better combat performance. They removed weight by stripping out any non-essential equipment. They even fabricated custom parts that improved reliability under Guadalcanal's brutal conditions.
Some of these modifications were later adopted officially by the Navy after engineers back in the States examined them and realized these field mechanics had independently solved problems that had stumped entire design teams. The men covered in mud and oil had become innovators by accident, advancing aviation maintenance simply by refusing to accept that broken meant finished. Then, October 13th arrived with intelligence that promised disaster. Coast watchers up the slot had radioed frantic warnings of a major Japanese air raid forming at Rabaul. At least 24 bombers with a heavy fighter escort would arrive at Henderson Field sometime after dawn. The goal was terrifyingly obvious. Their mission: destroy American air power on the ground before the next phase of the Japanese offensive could begin. Tokyo was fully committed to retaking Guadalcanal, and control of the air was the absolute prerequisite. Everything, and I mean everything, depended on the next 12 hours. As of 9 p.m. on the 12th, the situation was grim. 4 Wildcats were fully operational. 2 more were marginal, flyable, yes, but with mechanical issues that would ground them under any other circumstance. 3 others sat in their revetments with damage that ranged from serious to catastrophic. One had taken a 20mm cannon shell right through the engine cowling, cracking the crankcase and shattering 2 cylinders. Another had made a wheels-up landing after losing oil pressure, bending its propeller and damaging the engine mounts. The third had been strafed on the ground just 2 days earlier, riddled with machine gun fire that had punctured fuel lines, destroyed the instrument panel, and perforated the oil cooler. Major Joe Renner, the operations officer, looked at the status board and did the kind of math that just doesn't work. 6 aircraft against 24 raiders? The Japanese would get through. Their bombers would crater the runway. The parked aircraft would be destroyed. The entire defensive position would collapse, not from being overrun, but from being utterly unable to contest the air. He walked to the maintenance area where Sergeant Gay was already elbow-deep in the engine of the crashed Wildcat. "How many can you give me by dawn?" Gay didn't even look up from the crankcase he was inspecting. "How many do you need?" "All of them." "Then all of them." This wasn't bravado, it was a contract. The mechanics had 6 hours to perform miracles. And let's be clear, they had been performing miracles every single night for 2 months. This night would simply require a larger miracle. Word spread through the maintenance crews instantly. Every available man converged on the 3 damaged aircraft. The division of labor was instinctive. The most experienced mechanics took the engine work. Younger men handled everything else. Runners moved between the aircraft carrying parts, tools, anything needed. A human supply chain emerged from the chaos. The Wildcat with the cracked crankcase was the worst case. The entire engine needed to be replaced. Gaylor's team had exactly 1 spare engine, pulled 3 days earlier from a plane that had nosed over during landing. That engine was partially disassembled for inspection and hadn't been cleared for use. It didn't matter. Their job was to install it, fire it up, and just pray it held together. 4 men heaved the replacement engine into place, using a makeshift tripod hoist cobbled together from bamboo and cargo straps. Now, the kind of precision needed to marry an engine to an airframe, that usually took hours of painstaking, careful alignment. They managed it in just 40 minutes, guided only by flashlights, hand signals, and pure muscle memory. Next up was the wheels-up Wildcat. Its propeller was bent and the mounts were damaged, but the engine itself? It was potentially salvageable. Corporal Mann's crew got to work on the propeller. Now, in theory, a prop damaged by impact was supposed to be sent back to a depot for inspection and rebalancing. But in practice, there was no depot, and there were no replacement propellers. So man improvised. He grabbed a sledgehammer and used a tree stump as an anvil. He heated the bent blades with a blowtorch and then hammered them back into something resembling alignment. It was a barbaric method, absolutely, but it was also their only option. This propeller would be dangerously out of balance. It was guaranteed to vibrate. It might even fail catastrophically at high RPM. But it would turn. And a plane with a rough propeller was infinitely better than a plane with no propeller at all. The strafed Wildcat presented a whole different set of problems. The engine might have been intact, but all its auxiliary systems were completely shredded.
Private Bauer took charge of the fuel system repair. Every single line had to be replaced, but he had no proper aircraft-grade fuel lines to work with. So he scavenged rubber hoses from a destroyed truck, cutting and fitting them to roughly follow the routing of the original lines. Of course, the connections leaked. He sealed them up with friction tape and a whole lot of hope. The oil cooler was a lost cause, shot through with holes. He ripped it out entirely and fabricated a bypass using copper tubing that he hammered flat and bent into shape. Without a cooler, the engine would run dangerously hot. But it would run hot for one mission, maybe two, and right now that was enough. Midnight came and went. The frantic work continued under glaring lights that made every man a perfect target if Japanese bombers decided to show up. Thankfully, they didn't. The Tokyo Express had already sailed past, delivering the naval shelling that was supposed to soften up Henderson Field for the morning raid. That battleship bombardment had been absolutely terrifying, but ultimately it was pretty ineffective. Most of the shells had just fallen harmlessly in the jungle or cratered empty sections of the runway. The precious aircraft had survived. Now they just needed to get them to fly. At 0200 hours, 2 in the morning, Gaylor's team finished bolting the replacement engine into the first Wildcat. Fuel lines were connected, control cables were rigged, instruments wired up. It looked complete. But looking complete meant nothing until that engine roared to life. Gaylor primed the cylinders, set the mixture, and slammed the starter. The propeller lurched. The engine coughed once, twice, then erupted with a deafening roar, spitting flames from its exhaust stacks. The entire aircraft shook violently. The engine was running rough. You could hear it missing on at least one cylinder, but it was running. Gaylor let it warm up for a tense 2 minutes, then cut the power. One aircraft recovered. By 0330, Mann's crew had finished their miracle work on the second Wildcat. The hammered-out propeller was bolted on. The engine mounts were now reinforced with makeshift plates, literally cut from the wreckage of a Japanese truck. It looked like something a madman had cobbled together in a fever dream. Mann himself climbed into the cockpit and fired it up. The vibration was instantaneous and severe. The entire airframe shuddered as if it was about to rip itself to pieces. Mann pushed it to half throttle. The shaking intensified, but didn't get worse. He held it there for 30 agonizing seconds, listening, feeling, making a judgment call that would either save or condemn the pilot destined to fly this machine. He throttled back, shutting it down. It would fly. The pilot would just have to wrestle with the vibration. 2 aircraft recovered. Bauer's fuel system repair was finally done by 0415. The engine started normally, running smooth as silk for a full minute, but then it began to sputter, losing power. The jury-rigged fuel lines were leaking under pressure. Bauer shut it down, frantically tightened every connection he could, and wrapped everything in more layers of tape. He restarted it.
The leak was slower, but it hadn't stopped. Fuel was now dripping onto the scorching hot engine, a catastrophic fire hazard that broke every single safety rule in the book. Bauer made the call. It would fly, at least until the fuel lines failed completely. How long that would be was anyone's guess. 3 aircraft recovered. Dawn was now just 40 minutes away. Ground crews were swarming the 7 flyable Wildcats, loading them with .50 caliber ammunition and fueling them from hand-pumped drums. The pilots were already strapped into their cockpits, engines warming up. They'd all been briefed on the state of their planes. The 3 resurrected fighters were marked with a slash of red paint on the cowling, a stark warning that they were flying something dangerously marginal. Not a single pilot refused their assignment. At 0520 hours, the call came in from the Coast Watcher network. The Japanese formation had launched from Rabaul. Their estimated time of arrival over Henderson Field was 35 minutes. Rayner gave the order. All aircraft scramble. The 7 Wildcats began rolling toward the runway, the 3 rebuilt planes deliberately placed at the very end of the takeoff sequence.
The plan ensured that if one plane failed on takeoff, it wouldn't block the runway for the others. The first 4 aircraft got airborne without a single incident. The 5th, one of the truly marginal planes, ran rough and sputtered, but it clawed its way into the sky successfully. The 6th Wildcat accelerated hard down the coral strip, bouncing over the uneven surface, before it too lifted into the morning air, trailing a telltale stream of oil smoke. And then came the 7th, Bauer's plane, with the patched-up fuel system. It began its takeoff roll, engine running, but audibly losing power. The fighter used every last foot of runway before staggering into the air, hovering barely above stall speed. It stayed airborne, desperately clawing for altitude as the pilot nursed the throttle, trying to keep the failing fuel system feeding the hungry engine. At 10,000 feet, the 7 Wildcats finally formed up and turned north. Below them, Henderson Field looked like an aviation graveyard. Wrecked aircraft lined the field, and shell craters pocked the runway. It had the look of a base that had been utterly defeated. From that altitude, you couldn't see the mechanics collapsing into exhausted sleep in the mud. You couldn't see the tools still scattered around the frantic work areas. You couldn't see the miracle that had just occurred. At 0602 hours, the Japanese formation appeared as just dots on the horizon. Then they grew. 27 Betty bombers in a tight, disciplined formation, with a staggering 180 escorts weaving above them. The Japanese pilots saw the 7 American fighters rising up to meet them and felt the first shock of confusion. Intelligence had assured them American fighter strength was nearly depleted. These 7 aircraft simply should not exist. Where had they come from? Had reinforcements arrived during the night? The Japanese formation leader didn't break formation. Orders were orders. The target was Henderson Field. They continued their push south. The American fighters hit them head-on. 7 against 45 were impossible odds, but the mathematics of air combat don't scale in a linear fashion. 7 determined fighters attacking a bomber formation can create chaos completely out of proportion to their numbers. The Wildcats dove right through the zero screen, ignoring the escorts, and went directly for the bombers. Guns hammered, bombers staggered. The tight Japanese formation began to unravel as pilots took evasive action. Bauer's Wildcat, the one with the failing fuel system, got in one high-side pass before the engine quit entirely. Fuel starvation. The jury-rigged lines had finally failed. The pilot, Lieutenant James Sweat, didn't even try to restart. He simply put the fighter into a silent glide, aiming for the coastline.
He managed to reach the water, ditching the plane just a quarter-mile from shore. A Higgins boat would pull him from the water 2 hours later. His fighter slipped beneath the waves in just 30 seconds. It had only seen 7 minutes of combat before that makeshift fuel system finally gave out. But those 7 minutes, they were enough. Another pilot's Wildcat, vibrating so badly it felt like he was riding a jackhammer, somehow stayed in the fight even longer. Despite the bone-shaking ride, his guns still worked, and the engine kept churning out power. He successfully shot down one Betty bomber and damaged another before the propeller's vibration suddenly got much, much worse. Something in the hub assembly was breaking apart. He had to break off the attack and race for Henderson Field, landing as the prop shook so violently that chunks of the spinner tore loose on touchdown. That plane would never fly again. It had given one mission, and one mission was all it needed to give. Then there was the rebuilt fighter, fitted with a replacement engine. It fought for a full 12 minutes before a Zero shot it out of the sky. The pilot managed to bail out over friendly territory and simply walked back to Henderson Field later that afternoon. And that engine? The one installed in total darkness? The one that was never properly tested? It had performed flawlessly right up until Japanese bullets, not a mechanical failure, finally silenced it.
The Japanese raid itself was completely broken up before it even reached its target. Only 8 bombers actually made it to Henderson Field, and they were forced to drop their payloads from high altitude with terrible accuracy. The damage was minimal. 4 Japanese bombers were confirmed shot down. Another 3 were so badly damaged they crashed while trying to make it back to Rabaul. In total, the Japanese lost 11 aircraft. The Americans lost just 2 fighters, and both pilots were recovered safely. By the cold, hard math of aerial combat, it was a decisive American victory. But the real victory was one the surviving Japanese pilots couldn't see as they filed their reports. Back at their base, Japanese intelligence officers reviewed the pilot debriefs with a growing sense of confusion. 7 American fighters had intercepted their raid. 7. Their own operational estimates had predicted the Americans would be lucky to put 4, maybe 5 aircraft in the air that morning. The difference was small, but it was deeply significant. Where were these extra planes coming from? No convoys had been spotted overnight, no transport flights had been seen. It was as if the Americans were conjuring fighter strength out of thin air. Commander Nakajima updated his logs, his frustration mounting. This pattern had been repeating for weeks now. Japanese attacks would destroy American planes with clockwork regularity. Japanese reconnaissance planes flew over, their cameras clicking. Down below, the twisted metal of American fighters confirmed their pilots' kill claims. But something was wrong with the math. Day after day, the number of American fighters in the sky just didn't drop like it should. One Japanese officer, puzzled, wrote detailed reports arguing the Americans must be getting way more reinforcements than anyone thought. His superiors read the reports, nodded, and updated their intelligence. But the real reason never crossed their minds. The idea that the Americans were literally raising aircraft from the dead? It was unthinkable, a complete violation of everything they understood about modern air warfare. Meanwhile, back at Henderson Field, the mechanics were already swarming over the wreckage. The official count was 2 aircraft lost, which meant 2 aircraft needed to be replaced. Simple as that. By late afternoon, the mangled planes from that morning's brutal fight had been dragged back to the makeshift workshops. To an outsider, they looked like scrap. But to these mechanics, they were treasure troves of salvageable parts. One of the pilots had to ditch his plane in the water. He reported that his engine just quit, a fuel system problem.
A man named Bauer took it personally, immediately getting to work designing a tougher, field-expedient fix for the fuel lines. As for the other wreck, the one with the shattered propeller hub, it was cannibalized for parts within hours of being recovered. Its engine, miraculously intact, was slated to be transplanted into another waiting airframe in just 2 days. This incredible effort didn't go unnoticed by the top brass. Major Rennie R. fired off a commendation to headquarters, making sure to name the specific mechanics who'd pulled all-nighters. Several of them would even be awarded Bronze Stars for their heroism. The official citations, of course, were a little vague. They spoke of extraordinary initiative and dedication to duty under combat conditions. What they conveniently left out were the nitty-gritty details. The welded crankcases, the propellers literally hammered back into shape, or the fuel lines scavenged from old truck parts. The effect on morale was electric, spreading through the entire garrison at Henderson Field. The Marines dug in along the perimeter heard the news. The morning's air raid had been turned back. They didn't get the details, and frankly, they didn't need them. All that mattered was that American fighters were still in the sky, still fighting, still winning. It was proof they hadn't been abandoned on this rock. It meant that this tiny, battered Air Force would be there for them when the next ground attack inevitably came. And that knowledge, that reassurance, was worth more than a shipload of fresh troops. The psychological impact on the Japanese side was harder to quantify, but it was just as real. Their pilots would return to their base at Rabaul with frustrating reports. Despite weeks of relentless attacks, American air power just wasn't breaking. This flew in the face of the entire strategic story the Japanese commanders had been telling themselves, and it was deeply unsettling. The prevailing story, the one the Japanese were telling themselves, was that American strength was fading, that Guadalcanal was teetering on the brink of collapse, that just one more big push would shatter the defenders. But what if that story was a lie? What if American air power wasn't declining? If that were true, then the entire narrative was wrong. And if the narrative was wrong, the whole Japanese operational plan for retaking the island had to be thrown out and re-evaluated. And so, through October and November, this bizarre pattern just kept repeating. Japanese bombing raids would swarm in, and a handful of American fighters, sometimes just 4 or 5, would claw their way into the sky to meet them. Planes that were so shot up they should have been scrapped for parts were somehow back in the fight just days later. Japanese kill claims soared into the hundreds, yet the Americans just kept flying. This mathematical impossibility started to mess with Japanese planning. If a war of attrition wasn't working, what would work? The answer, it seemed, was nothing less than completely overwhelming force. Meanwhile, the bigger strategic picture was shifting, in ways neither side could fully grasp at the time. These grueling air battles over Guadalcanal were bleeding Japan's pilot corps dry at a rate they simply couldn't sustain. Their veteran aviators, the very same men who'd hit Pearl Harbor and swept across Southeast Asia, were being killed or just worn down by sheer exhaustion and tropical diseases. And the replacements coming in? They were greener, less experienced, and just not as skilled. On the American side, the opposite was happening. Pilot quality was actually improving. The survivors were hardening into seasoned veterans. Their tactics were being sharpened in the crucible of combat. And those patched-up, cobbled-together aircraft? They were being flown by men who knew exactly how to squeeze every last ounce of performance out of them. The unsung heroes in all this, the mechanics at Henderson Field, finally got some official recognition when Navy engineers visited in late November. These engineers came expecting to find a total disaster, a deteriorating maintenance situation that needed their immediate intervention. What they found instead was organized chaos, a whirlwind of activity that was somehow keeping planes in the air at a rate that was better than some fully stocked rear area depots. The engineers interviewed the exhausted mechanics. They examined the bizarre improvised repairs, and they documented innovations that broke every rule in the book. Their final report basically said, "Look, the way they're doing things here is highly irregular, but you can't argue with the results." They even recommended that some of these field modifications be formalized and adopted elsewhere. Art Stahl's and James Galler's crankcase welding technique, for instance, was studied and refined by Navy metallurgists. They gave it proper welding rods and better preheating procedures, and soon it became an officially authorized field repair for certain types of damage. Corporal Mann's engine swap procedures were actually studied for their time efficiency. Elements of his approach were then incorporated into revised technical manuals for expeditionary maintenance. Private Bauer's various fabrication techniques were documented as official examples of acceptable field-expedient repairs when proper parts simply weren't available. The very men who had invented these techniques out of sheer desperation became inadvertent yet crucial contributors to military maintenance doctrine. The human cost, however, was significant but largely invisible. The mechanics worked themselves to the point of physical breakdown. Malaria hospitalized a third of all maintenance personnel at various points. Accidents related to pure exhaustion injured many others. 2 mechanics were killed when a Japanese night raid caught them working on exposed aircraft. The work was never safe, and it never, ever stopped. When mechanics were too sick to stand, they would sit on ammunition crates and just keep working. When their hands shook from a raging fever, they tied tools to their wrists so they wouldn't drop them. This dedication bordered on the obsessive, because the alternative was completely unthinkable. By December, American control of Guadalcanal was secure. Henderson Field expanded from a single coral strip into a full airbase complex with multiple runways, proper revetments, and eventually real maintenance facilities. Supply lines finally stabilized. Replacement parts began arriving with regularity. The desperate days of improvisation slowly began to fade into memory. The mechanics who had kept the Cactus Air Force flying were rotated home, replaced by fresh personnel who would never fully understand the miracle their predecessors had accomplished. The Japanese never did solve the puzzle of Henderson Field. Post-war analysis of Japanese intelligence documents shows they consistently overestimated American aircraft numbers on Guadalcanal throughout the entire campaign. They never understood that the Americans were not receiving massive reinforcements. They never grasped that the same exact aircraft were being killed, resurrected, and then killed again. The concept was just too far outside Japanese operational doctrine to be seriously considered. This intelligence failure directly contributed to faulty strategic planning that committed vital resources to a battle that was already lost. The final accounting showed that Henderson Field mechanics maintained an average aircraft availability rate of approximately 50% throughout the critical period from August to December 1942. In peacetime, a rate like that would have been considered a catastrophic failure. In a combat zone with no supply chain and constant battle damage, what unfolded was a triumph of human ingenuity over impossible circumstances. Consider this: the Japanese, operating from established bases with intact supply lines, maintained an aircraft availability rate of around 65%. That 15-point difference should have been decisive,
But it wasn't, because Japanese calculations never accounted for the American ability to resurrect their dead aircraft. Decades later, military historians studying the Guadalcanal campaign would identify the Henderson Field mechanics as an unrecognized yet critical factor in the American victory. The air battles are what get remembered. The pilots become legends. The ground combat is documented in painstaking detail. But the men, covered head to toe in oil and mud, working through the night to make broken things fly again, they remain largely forgotten outside of specialist military histories. This is truly unfortunate because their contribution represented something fundamentally important about how America fought the Second World War. These mechanics embodied a cultural approach to problem solving that was distinctly American. They came from a society that celebrated the practical inventor, the garage tinkerer, the person who just made do with the resources they had. The Great Depression had reinforced these very values across an entire generation. So, when the war demanded impossible solutions, these men provided them.
Not because they were ordered to, but because they had spent their entire lives learning how. They saw a broken aircraft not as a write-off, but as a challenge. They saw a lack of parts not as an insurmountable obstacle, but as an open invitation to improvise. The Japanese approach wasn't inferior, just profoundly different. Japanese engineering and manufacturing were absolutely world-class. Japanese pilots were superbly trained. But the Japanese system was built on an assumption of logistical stability and strict procedural adherence. When those assumptions broke down, the system struggled to adapt. The Americans, by contrast, had built flexibility right into their cultural DNA. The mechanic who had kept a Depression-era tractor running with baling wire saw no fundamental difference between that and keeping a Wildcat flying with parts from 3 different engines. Both were just problems that required solutions. And both could be solved if you were willing to ignore the people telling you it couldn't be done. This philosophical difference extended far beyond one airfield on one island. Throughout the Pacific War, American forces showed a remarkable talent to adapt, improvise, and conquer logistical nightmares through raw innovation, not rigid procedure. The Japanese, despite their sophisticated tech and fierce dedication, really struggled to match that flexibility. The mechanics on Guadalcanal were an early, dramatic example of a pattern that would repeat itself across the entire war. But this lesson goes way beyond that specific moment in history. Modern military logistics still struggles with the balance between procedural control and initiative in the field. Today's aircraft are exponentially more complex than World War II fighters. The idea of an improvised repair seems almost unthinkable in an age of computerized systems and micro-tolerances. And yet, the fundamental challenge is exactly the same. How do you maintain fighting capability when the perfect solution simply isn't available? The answer forged at Henderson Field still resonates powerfully. You trust the people closest to the problem. You protect their freedom to innovate. You judge by results, not by procedures. And you have to recognize that sometimes the most important victories don't happen in the air, but down in the mud, where broken machines are made whole again by human will and mechanical skill. The mechanics at Henderson Field never imagined they were making history. They were just doing the job in front of them, getting the next aircraft ready for its next mission. That their incredible work confused Japanese intelligence and contributed to a strategic victory was almost incidental. They weren't fighting some grand campaign. They were keeping promises to the pilots who depended on them with their lives. They were meeting the challenge placed before them by circumstances they couldn't control. And in doing so, they became part of something far larger than themselves. A collective effort that turned the tide of a war, one repaired engine at a time. The wrench turned, the metal held, the aircraft flew, and the impossible just became routine.